Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and today I'm going to be talking about my experience of reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain and James by Percival Everett. So this is going to be a little bit filmed all over the place because I've got a lot to do today, but I really wanted to get this video out, so it's just going to mean you're going to have to come with me while I run errands, and we'll keep talking about it as I go. But to start, let me just explain how I went about reading these two books and why I went about them this way. So my plan to read these two books started with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I read this in the month of August, and then I followed it up by reading in the month of September James by Percival Everett. And I very much intentionally wanted to read these two books together. My understanding was that James was a reimagining of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I read Huckleberry Finn way back in middle school and have not read it again ever since then, but I did recall not really liking this book, but having no idea why. So I did want to take the time to go back and reread it, and especially because it was a reimagining, I wanted to know what was being reimagined. And I get the word reimagining from the inside flap of this book, so that's not my term for it, that's how it describes itself. I did a whole video where I talked about how I was going to compare these two books, and I have chosen somewhere between comparatively reading them as well as syntopically reading them. I didn't truly syntopically read them because that would have meant that I would have been reading them at the same time. I didn't do that. I kind of wish I had, but I did read them back to back. I decided that the main thing that I was going to focus on in my reading was the change in the point of view and the change in the characters and how that impacted the narrative. Before I get going and talking about the point of view and the characters, I do want to talk about what I feel like are the two very distinct themes that come up in this book in terms of how they sort of describe themselves within the story. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, even in the name of the book, is very much an adventure story of the titular character. And this is a book where you are really supposed to be going on the adventures with Huck Finn down the Mississippi River. Everything he talks about, he describes as being sort of the next adventure that he's on, wanting to be adventurous by Tom Sawyer and all the like. And I think that sense of adventure and that theme of adventure is carried very strongly through the book, and I also feel like has a lot to do with how Huck ends up telling the story of what happened to him, because this story is largely about Huckleberry Finn, and in it there is a runaway slave named Jim who shows up in the story as, I would say, probably a main side character. Comparatively, in the book of James by Percival Everett, you have the main character being James, or Jim, who was the runaway slave in The Adventures of Huck Finn, and in this case, Huckleberry Finn is the side character. In this book is not described as an adventure story, but I would say is closer to what I would think of as being a runaway slave narrative, or as some people would say, a slave narrative. It is definitely more about the story of James himself running away from his enslavement and everything that's involved in that. It talks a lot about the slave experience, and that comes largely from the change of perspective and impacts how all the characters in the book are portrayed and seen. Okay, so I'm in the car, clearly. I'm not even in the right car yet. Everything's packed in the other car, but I have to move this car before I can go on my first errand. But good time and quiet space to give a little update, or not an update, but to start with the first question. So I am going to work my way through the questions that I included in the video about how to syntopically read. So question number one is how were the characters handled in each of the books? What were the similarities? What were the differences? All that kind of thing, their characterization. So in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and it's starting to hail, so I'm sorry if there is actually more noise in this setting than I thought. In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck is basically considered an unreliable narrator by his own words, which is really interesting. And Jim is sort of a caricature. A lot of people have complained of what a Black person is and what Black enslaved people were like. I think that's fairly accurate. There is a huge disparity in the amount of characterization that is given to these two figures, even though they are characters that appear throughout the book of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Interestingly enough, in the book of James, the character development of both characters is much better. Um, Huck is definitely portrayed as just a mere boy. The number of times that he is referred to as just a boy or simply a boy or a mere boy is really prominent and I think very intentional. It solidly places him as a young kid who a lot of his actions are almost being explained away by his youthfulness. I think it's very much an intentional highlighting of just how young Huck actually is and how unaware he is of what's really going on, which I do think you get a sense of that in Mark Twain's book, but I think for me it stood out way more in Percival's account of it. James, on the other hand, is a very deeply developed man in the book James. He is portrayed as a very strong, very aware, highly intelligent, survivalist of his situation. He is a strong black male figure who is hyper aware of what is going on and what his role is supposed to be in the world that he's living in. In some ways, I think the roles are switched between which one of them has the most self awareness and worldly awareness in the books. I think both books are similar in that, they have this aspect of a travel narrative going on in terms of these are the two people who are traveling together. And their lives do have some parallels to them. The parallels are much stronger and much more pointed out, I think, in Huckleberry Finn than in James. I think they move from strong similarities in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn to being more distant from one another in their experiences in the book of James. And that gets me into the differences in the characters in these two books. I think in James, it's very intentional that their lives aren't portrayed as being very similar to one another. I think that's also slightly more realistic. I do think it was intentional on Mark Twain's part that he wanted there to be parallels in the lives of Huck Finn and Jim. I think my theory, at least, is that those parallels were supposed to have people first sympathize with Huckleberry's plight and flight from his father and sort of parallel those same issues with James, perhaps in the hopes of making people sympathize more with Jim in the book The Huckleberry Finn. I don't think that was successful, but I do feel like that was part of the intent. In the book James, I feel like Percival Everett got rid of what were a lot of the similarities in their storylines. And I think that led that being to while they were traveling together, you're realizing that they still had very, very different lives from one another because they had very different experiences. They were different races. And I think he put a solid divide between their characters even potentially experiencing the same lives or outcomes. And I think especially by the end of the book, you realize like why that kind of had to be the case for where he was taking the book and where he wanted the story to go and sort of one of the points that he makes at the end of the story. I think it was necessary that his characters be having very different experiences in James, whereas in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, especially at the start, again, for the theme and the message of the book and Huckleberry Finn, there was some part of it that needed them to have similar lives. So those are kind of my thoughts on some of the major differences between the characters within the books. I think the characters were more similar in Huckleberry Finn, and that fit Mark Twain's message. I think there was a lot of disparity between how the characters were portrayed, and the differences between their lives and their ability to connect with those, I think was much stronger in James. And again, because I think that had a lot to do with the messaging of the story. And I'm not going to give. Okay, so I'm back home. Definitely took everything with me to talk more about it on that whole car ride. And did I really? No, not really. Like, the errands got out of control. I almost forgot about a doctor's appointment. And by the end, I just had to rush through everything and get back home. And then there was another HVAC appointment that I also forgot about. So this day has not been a success. And to show you just how crazy it is, I was using as a bookmark in my notebook my car keys. I don't know what that says about today, but I'm finally back home. It's way later in the day. It's like 5 o'clock in the evening now. And let's finish this not a vlog, but also definitely not a static film video, whatever is going on. So it's been a long time for me and seconds for you, but question 2. What was missing or included in each of the books? And I wrote down a couple of things. One, I think one of the things that immediately stood out to me with that was someone does not show up at the end of James. And I think anyone who has read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn will agree that that is a very good thing. There is a surprise cameo, is what it ends up feeling like at the end of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, that takes the story in a completely different direction. And in my opinion, takes what was an okay book and just completely ruins it and takes it in a really bizarre and I would say inhuman direction, where it takes the idea of that adventure to a whole different level and just a place that honestly really churned my stomach and made me mad at the end of the book, where up to that point it had been like, there's definitely problematic aspects of this, but it was kind of working as a satire. It ceased to be a satire. I guess that character could have also been reimagined, but in my opinion, reimagining him not being there is the best proof of imagination I need from Percival Everett. Like, just, yeah, you don't belong here, is what I'm thinking. The other thing is, and I guess this will get into some more spoilers, so I will again put spoiler up on the screen and you can skip this part if you don't want to be spoiled. But if you want to know, I will mention it without going into great detail as to who the characters are and the events surrounding it. But clearly in James, there was the inclusion of people who were passings. You had multiple cases of African Americans who were passing as white. Some knew that they were doing this, some didn't, and there were some attempts of this. This idea of passing was not at all mentioned in Mark Twain's book. I don't feel like that's a surprise, really. I don't even know that Mark Twain would have known that people passed at that time. So that is a new topic that is introduced to James on multiple levels and for a variety of different reasons. And I think it was used very well and successfully in that book and was part of what happened in James that allowed that book to explore more topics from the point of view of an African American character. I think it's in a lot of ways logical that that's not something that Huckleberry Finn would have been aware of in Mark Twain's book. And I think the reasons are obvious. He wasn't Black. This is something that outside the African American community for a very long time was not talked about, that people were doing this for, hopefully obvious reasons. Both books clearly included the two characters, but Huckleberry Finn, again, included James as a very side character and pretty much just as an enslaved person in all the caricatures that go along with that, and typically falling on the negative side. What you have included in the book James is a lot more discussions of more African Americans. You have more African American characters. You have more run-ins with different enslaved people. And I would also argue that you kind of have the character of James himself, referred to in Huck Finn only as Jim. And I think this is sort of a new character and a new side of James or Jim that you are introduced to. And I think it's relevant that there is a name change there, because I think there's a lot of character development in the book James that you don't get in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And I would also say that included in both books are the relationship between Huckleberry Finn and James, but they're very, very different relationships. In Huck Finn, you have them relating a bit more as friends and sort of as equals and seeing each other in a similar way. Though I would argue you also have a bit of slave master relationship with them, or at least Jim relating to Huck more closely to an enslaved person to their master would, or their master's child. In James, I think you have a little bit closer to an adult-child relationship for sure, where James is definitely taking the role of the adult in the relationship, and I would not call it a friendship in James. Like, James is very much like, okay, you're here with me, and for a variety of reasons, I feel responsible for you, and there is some sort of connection, but it's very tenuous. It's not explained until much, much later in the book, and it's definitely a different relationship. I did come to some final thoughts on it, largely that I think the change of perspective and the change of character in terms of who the protagonist was in these books led to a significantly better book in James. I don't know that that was necessarily Percival Everett's intention. I have seen an interview or two where he talks about he wasn't, really trying to tear apart the adventures of Huckleberry Finn or, dissect it or criticize it per se. But I do think the change in perspective and what he did just with the character alone took some major flaws in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and resolved them. One of the biggest problems I had when reading the adventures of Huckleberry Finn outside, the use of the N-word throughout the entire book, was just, I felt like some of what was happening in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn had to happen because Huck was a young boy. And there were times where I just couldn't help feel that if Mark Twain had used a character who was slightly older, maybe still a child, maybe still a youth, that he wouldn't have been forced into some of the weird plotting that I felt like went on. And I felt like he took that child character, but he didn't use it for the purpose that he wanted the book to be used for, especially when you got to the end and introduced another child into the book. So having James, one, just be an adult who's telling this story, I think opened up this to a whole nother conversation. As did clearly having it be the enslaved person telling the story as opposed to somebody who's fairly bought into the system of slavery, that being Huck. I think the brilliance of James in part comes with the fact that it leaves room, surprisingly enough, for the original story to still be told just as Mark Twain wrote it. I was expecting to come into James thinking that it was in some way, whether intentional or not, going to end up obliterating the original story, which I think there's pros and cons to doing that with any story. So I was very surprised to find that the way James was told and the way the book concluded still left a lot of room for Twain's book to exist as it was written. But I feel like it also somehow made Twain's book more coherent and made it work better and made the story you got there more acceptable and understandable that you got that story. Because I think you do see parts of Twain's story come out in James's telling of it, but you can see how with the explanation you get at the end of the book, how that would have manifested. So because of all that, I think James as a reimagining is extremely successful and actually takes what I think was just an okay/weak book and even made that book a better book. I very much appreciate the adventures of Huckleberry Finn more in light of James. So in a lot of ways, I could almost say that I don't feel like the adventures of Huckleberry Finn stands up very well as a book on its own. I think it has a lot of weaknesses, plot holes, and just problematic things. And even at the time this was written, apparently it wasn't very successful as a satire because people didn't get it. And I feel like you could say it's because the people at the time were so racist that they didn't get where the satire was in the racism. But I would disagree. Based on my reading of this book, I don't think it's a good satire. I would agree with the people at the time that it just comes across as like, okay, yeah, this is just everyday life. There's no problems with it. Like none of it's being questioned, or certainly not questioned enough for someone who is caught within that system of racism and thinks it's okay to see there anything wrong with this portrayal here. And I feel like people at that time would have just read it as an adventure story, and it's just an okay adventure story at best. So given that I did end up giving Huck basically a 2, I thought the worst part of this book was definitely the language, but then also the characterizations, and really the characterizations of everyone, but most especially Jim, who I just felt like was a very flat character compared to everyone else in the book, and at best was a caricature, and not even a good one at that, and therefore just left this awkward space in the book that did not feel intentional. I think if you're just focusing on the adventure that just Huck is having, I think it's possible to be like, okay, I'm along for this ride. There are some adventures in it. But even that gets ruined towards the end of the book, where it's just really hard to imagine as a reader how the ending of the book is still considered adventurous. For James, I ended up giving this a 5-star. It helped that I very much agree with quite a bit of the worldview in this book. I think it's much more realistic, which, you know, you could argue that wasn't really what Twain was going for, but I do think unintentionally that was what he hit on. And I think this book opens itself up to a lot more interesting and thought-provoking conversations. I thought the plot in this book was much more engaging, much better paced, and draws you in much more strongly than The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I think other advantages of James is that it added a ton of depth both to the characters, the things that they experience, the time and the setting I felt like was much better laid out in greater depth than Twain did. And again, the themes and the conversations that are had in this book are much more thought-provoking. Huck Finn, at the end of the day, I would say is a really problematic and fairly narrow story. The limits that are kind of placed on the narrator Huck by his age just kind of really narrow the scope of where this story could go. I don't think it's helpful, actually, for this story to be told from the perspective of a boy, or at least a boy as young as Twain makes him, because that tends to be the excuse, but also the problem, the way that Twain has worked it. Like, you probably could tell this story from a child's perspective, but I just don't think Twain did it well. And James, ultimately, I feel like is a reimagining. This feels truer to life, and that book, again, just adds a lot more depth and creativity to the telling of the story and the way the story is told in comparison to the original book, if you will. And I do think it's notable that one of the things that is said towards the end of the book is that the truth of being a runaway slave is that there is no adventure in it. And I can't help but think that's a very marked contrast from this book, where it's all about the adventure in this runaway, both of Huck and James. At the end of the day, what does this mean for the future of these books in my life and, you know, my future reading plans? Would I read books that are similar to these? Yes, I would read a book that is similar to Huck Finn as well as James. My hope would just be to read a book that is maybe told from a child's perspective that is just better than this particular one. I would still read books from both of these authors, though admittedly I'm way more excited about reading another book by Percival Everett than I am by Mark Twain. Though even Percival Everett himself says there's other books by Mark Twain that he likes better, so maybe I would start with one of those. Finally, would I recommend these books, and to whom? I would recommend both of these books, but for very different reasons. I would recommend The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as something to study, but not something to read as just like pleasurable consumption. I think there are for sure better adventure stories with young children in them. I think James is an excellent book, and this is a book that I would recommend to everyone. I think it talks about a lot of things that are still relevant. It is really relevant as historical fiction as well, and I think is just really well written and accessible to quite a few levels of readers and interest and backgrounds. So those are all my thoughts about The Adventures of Huck Finn and James, and I hope this video doesn't end up being too chaotic and that it's helpful and that you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've read one of these two books or both of them and what your thoughts were and what you think of this summary in general, other than the fact that it's a little wild. And that's it for today, and I will talk to you next time. Bye! Sorry if there was some background noise. There's someone in the other room who has chosen this moment to, I don't even know what, crinkle every plastic bag that we own. I think that's what's going on. I'll talk to you later.